U redu, nastavljamo sa programom. Ovo je sada treći panel kome je naslov Pravo lokalne zajednice da kaže ne. I upravo nam je to bila ideja kada smo razmišljali i planirali o ovom panelu. Želimo da čujemo od ljudi koji se baš bave ovom temom da li lokalna zajednica ima pravo da kaže ne i na koji način. Naš moderator ovog dela programa, imamo veliko zadovoljstvo, će biti Jevđenije iz Saveza ekoloških organizacija Srbije, inače iz lokalne inicijative Sačuvamo kablar, naš duhovni vođa, naša inspiracija, naša energija i snaga. I Polekol je ovim simbolično hteo da uključi SEOS organizaciju, jer oni jesu duša i srce ovog događaja. Tako da evo prepuštam mikrofon Jevđeni, izvoli.
Pa do sad sam imao tremu, sad imam veću. Hvala pre svega Pravo na vodu Polekolu, hvala SEOS-u, hvala mom matičnom udruženju i hvala svim ovim ljudima koje zaista počinjem da osjećam kao naše, zato što smo svi u istom ljudskom problemu širom sveta i počeli smo to da prepoznajemo. Sad ja ću se potruditi da ih što bolje predstavim, ali pre toga zašto je važno da imamo pravo na znanje i zašto je važno da kažemo ne i da imamo pravo da kažemo ne, to je usko povezano sa onim na što smo već skretali pažnju, a to je taj pojam resursni ili mineralni nacionalizam koji nam se nameće kao da je nešto loše što mi želimo da odbranimo zdravlje pre svega svojih predela i onda se te kompanije predstavljaju kao ugrožene od nas, jel da, strašnih žitelja tih predela koji samo žele da prosto nastave da žive. Nije to ništa nepoznato. Njihove lokalne zajednice također se u okviru svojih i duhovnih i fizičkih života, borbi i težnji bore da sačuvaju onaj predmet koji nažalost izostaje u školama, odnosno da sačuvaju prirodu i društvo. Najveća pobeda svih zajednica koje su se ovde okupile i koja se sadrži u tom imenu SEOS, odnosno Savez ekoloških organizacija Srbije, je upravo ta reč savez, jer smo putem saveza uspeli da steknemo poverenje jedni drugih, ohrabrenje onoj drugoj zajednici da kaže ne kao i nama samima. I evo sad vidimo i međunarodne zajednice se upućuju jedne na druge da kažu ne. I stekli smo znanje, pa je sada moguće da ako neko iz neke druge zajednice, kao na primjer Marica naša iz Levča, ne može da dođe, ili Milena iz Kosjerića, neko umjesto njih govori o problemima sa kojima je išao da se susretne na terenu, što je vrlo bitno, da budemo inkluzivni jedni prema drugima i da se uključimo u borbe. Eto, to je neki, da kažem, uvod. Ja ću vam sada predstaviti redom naše govornike, onako ukratko, ko su oni, odakle oni dolaze, njihove životne priče, donekle, njihove biografije koje su uzbudljive, zaista. Pa imamo Johnny Barber, je borac za ljudska prava, pisac i videograf, živi na teritoriji Anišinabe, to jest u severnoj Minnesoti. Mapira priču, to jest razvija tu mapu priče kako bi dokumentovao prvi front borbe protiv opresije. Eno ga tamo desno pored kamere, možete vidjeti gospodina, maše. Tako da, veruje da je čista voda, evo imamo nešto zajedničko već, veruje da je čista voda potreba čija vrednost prevazilazi bilo kakav profit, talon metals, i to jest Rio Tinta. Imamo i ovdje to da oni imaju svoje ćerke firme. Imamo Ricky Defoe, on je starešina, elder, na engleskom, vrlo lepa reč, možda smo je malo zaboravili, ovdje kod nas da poštujemo naše časne starine, bi bio neki stari naziv za one koje smo ranije poštovali i na koje smo se ugledali. On je član fonda Dulac Band i vodi ceremonije i uči o potrebi da se štiti voda, da se štite biljke, životinje i ljudi. Putovao je širom sveta da uči o rudarenju u svetu i bori se za to da se poštuju prava domorodaca, dakle nativnog naroda tla sa kog on potiče. Ja bih dodao samo da vodi ceremoniju lule i kolibe za znojenje, što je jedna divna praksa o kojoj treba da učimo i uopšte da se upoznajemo s tuđim praksama kako bi, kažem, bili inkluzivni i upoznali vrednost jedni drugih. Moment. Paula Makabe je advokat koji radila sa klijentima u borbi protiv projekata koji ugrožavaju vazduh, vodu i ljudsko zdravlje. Radi kao pravnik i savjetnik za promene u politici u water legacy ili nasleđe vode, koje teži da se služi naukom, legitimnim zakonskim, dakle, strategijama i saradnjom sa plemenima, s nativnim tim ljudima koji žive tu u borbi protiv talon metala, odnosno Rio Tinta, dakle, protiv onih protiv kojih se i mi borimo. Samo jedan moment. Shanai Matteson je umetnica i kulturni organizator, što mi je posebno drago, zato što umetnost fali i umetnici fale da svojim dojmom kažu zašto je važno ne samo da se lepo opiše ili oslika cvet, nego i da se zaštiti i da se ukaže na probleme toga da se biljke, životinje, cveće, ljudi trebaju štititi. Dakle, ona također stanuje na Anishinaabe teritoriji, to jest u severnoj Minnesoti, u United States, u Sjedinjenim Državama. Ona je jedan od osnivača članova grupe Tamarack Water Alliance ili Tamarack, Savez za vodu, i organizuje se sa drugim kako ovo da prevedem, rural residers, sa drugim, ajde da kažem, seoskim stanovnicima i neprofitabilnim grupama u toj regiji da se odupre talon metalu, odnosno Rio Tintu. Jen Moril je menadžer, tailings campaign menadžer u Earthworks, dakle menadžer za kampanje u Earthworks, kako bi to preveo na srpski, možda radovi zemlje, ali to je zvaničan naziv. To je organizacija Sjedinjenih Država koja radi sa zajednicama na koje utiču projekti ekstrakcije da bi zaustavila onu štetu koja je izazvana neodgovornim rudarenjem. Fokus joj je na otpadu koji ostaje, odnosno na jalovištima, i imali smo prilike da ona na to još juče skrene pažnju. Radi sa raznim zajednicama kroz ceo svet koje su direktno pogođene opasnim otpadom, uključujući i one u Brazilu, Dominikanskoj Republici, Južnoj Africi, i ona želi da pronađe najbolja rješenja kako lokalno, tako i globalno. Alan Richardson, to je Alan, se borio sa predatorima u predatory banks, predatorima u Meksiku, Novom Meksiku, i organizator je Akorna. Samo da vidim, izvinite. Organizovao se i borio protiv predloženog Polymet rudnika sa Water Legacy i bio je aktivan član u organizaciji Honored Earths protiv Sandpiper Pipelines. Odnosno, kako bih to preveo? Naftovodi, hvala vam. Trenutno je organizator u Ispoštujmo zemlju, odnosno Honor the Earth, i radi na kampanji, Talon Mine kampanji. Eto, ne znam da li sam nešto malo ovako... Izvinjavam se na trokiranju, pošto sam pokušavao da prevodim u hodu. Ali uglavnom to su naši saborci iz različitih delova sveta. Ja sam pokušao malo da skratim biografiju, pošto su malo ovimne, ali su divne. I prvi put u životu sam pokušao da budem kratak, tako da ne zamerite. Hvala vam svakako. Aha, postavljam. Pa ne, idem Sabinu. Ću postavljati odavde.
Well, hello, friends. So I'm Alan Richardson, and as he was saying, we are a delegation from the so-called United States. And Ricky's presentation will be later, so stick around for that. At the end of this presentation, there will be a question and answer session at the end. So again, as he said, we represent several organizations, including Earthworks, Water Legacy, Honor the Earth, and the Fond du Lac Band, a sovereign tribal nation. So the title of our presentation is The Right to Say No. And when we say the right to say no, that includes all of civil society. But much of our work is about indigenous rights and the central role that they have and that they play in this subject of extractivism. And we're here to share our experience with you, and part of that story is about a copper mine proposal that's backed by the Swiss commodities giant Glencore that we were able to defeat through some incredible strategic work, an alliance between the Fond du Lac Band and Water Legacy and other allies. And so we'll be talking in detail about that. I will say that I'm wearing a shirt. This is from the 20-year celebration of a sulfide mine that was defeated in Wisconsin when two local native tribes wound up purchasing the deposit. And that is itself an amazing story, and they probably didn't foresee that being the way that they were going to defeat it. So you have to keep your mind open to different strategies. But then we're going to, so while we did defeat the Polymet mine, we're now facing a Rio Tinto, the project, the Talon mine. The fear is that Rio Tinto and their junior partner Talon is learning from the mistakes that Glencore made, and so it's going to be a long and difficult fight. Having said that, let's get right into it, and our first presentation is going to be from Earthworks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. It really is an honor for us to be able to come and meet all of you, share experiences, learn from your struggles, because you've been so inspiring to us in the United States, watching what you've been doing here in Serbia against Rio Tinto. So it really is a privilege for us to be here, and we appreciate this dialogue that we get to have with you. So my name is Jan Moril. I work at Earthworks, as you already heard. And Earthworks, now I'm just dropping everything, has 30 years of experience supporting communities on the front line of extraction projects. So oil, natural gas, and hard rock mining. We work all over the United States, or what's known as the United States, and we also work with communities internationally. And what we try to do is support local organizing and support local work to uplift that, support with resources, and then advocate for policy changes based on the experiences of local communities. And ways that we do that are trying to bring our partners and allies into the spaces where decisions are made. So I think my role today in this presentation is to start with some context. In order to make decisions about saying no to a mine, we need to understand some of the nitty-gritty details of mining. I know that there's a lot of experience in this room around the impacts and devastating consequences of mining, and it'll be interesting to hear from all of you in the question and answer period. But I'm going to share some kind of general figures, statistics, get us all on the same page, and then share a little bit of the experience in the United States around policy and around mining. So with that, as we all know, mining is a threat to communities, climate, and ecosystems. Mining causes human rights abuses. It causes water impacts, air impacts, agricultural impacts. It disproportionately threatens indigenous rights and livelihoods. It is carbon intensive, and so like Diego shared with us earlier this morning, the narrative is trying to greenwash us into thinking that mining is the solution to climate change, but there's so much research to show that that's not true. And then mining poses a risk to the oceans and the health of the oceans on the planet. And just to kind of give a little bit of context from the United States, where we've had hundreds of years of mining projects, mining is the most polluting industry in the United States. Since the US government started recording the amount of toxins released by companies and industries, mining has been #1 on that list every single year. And in 2021, it accounted for 44% of the toxins released in the United States. Mining is a water risk, we all know this, but just again to give some context from the United States, 40% of the rivers in the western part of the United States are polluted by mining from historic and current mining projects. 40% of our rivers have been polluted in the United States. And a lot of times, one thing that I think is really important to remember is that when a mining company comes to a community, they say, or they come to a local government or a tribal government, they say, we're not going to pollute the water. We have this water filtration system. We have these great liners for our waste, like Diego was talking about. We have all of this science that's going to help us make sure that we won't impact your water here. And Earthworks commissioned some research a number of years ago that looked at what mining companies said in their environmental impact assessments or the documents that they present to the government when they're applying for a permit versus what actually happened. And the research found that 100% of the companies said they would have no negative impacts on the water. But in reality, 76% of the companies polluted the water, right? So mining companies have this discourse that they're going to do it better this time. And the research shows that they don't know what their impacts are going to be, and they don't do it better when they do mine. Mining waste is its own kind of specific problem, and it's my field that I work in, so I'm going to spend a little time to talk about it. But there's a number of different types of mine waste. One type of waste is called tailings, and that's the waste that's left over after the ore and the rock is ground up, mixed with water and chemicals, and the metals are separated out. You then have this watery, dirty, muddy sludge that's called tailings. But basically, tailings are the trash, right? Typically, mine tailings are stored in dams that are built out of tailings themselves. So earthen dams, not built out of concrete or steel. They can grow to be hundreds of meters tall. There are tailings dams that the face of them are 2 kilometers long. They store hundreds of millions of cubic meters of waste. And some of them can be seen from outer space. They're the biggest man-made structures on the face of the earth. And one of the reasons for this, Diego mentioned this morning as well, ore grades are declining, so mining companies have to bring up more and more rock to get the metal that they're mining, which means they're producing more and more waste. And it's really important to remember that when a mining company leaves, they don't take their waste with them. The waste stays there. So there are between 20 and 30,000 tailings dams on the face of the earth right now from past and current mining operations. And those are there forever. They exist in perpetuity. And it's really important to remember as a community and as a local government when you're deciding whether or not you want mine, that you're stuck with that forever. And when the mining company finishes operations in 10 to 15 years or 30 years and closes and leaves, who's gonna maintain that tailings dam? Who's gonna make sure that it's safe? And that's a really important point because tailings dams are failing, they're collapsing with increasing frequency and increasing severity. So they're failing more often, and the failures are getting bigger and bigger because we're having these bigger and bigger tailings dams. And so what can go wrong? There's been 3 kind of catastrophic tailings dam failures since 2014. The first was at the Mount Poly mine in British Columbia, so in Canada, one of the regulatory jurisdictions that are always pointed to as mining is being done better in Canada, where it was at the Mount Poly mine, and 24 million cubic meters of mine waste flowed out of the tailings dam, destroyed salmon habitat in local rivers. It impacted the livelihood and health of 23 indigenous tribes that lived in that area. And the next year, the São Marco mine's tailings dam in Brazil failed. It released 32 million meters of cubic meters of waste, killed 19 people, and contaminated 600 kilometers of a river. It flowed all the way to the Atlantic Ocean from inland Brazil. And then this was a mine that was owned by the Brazilian mining company Vale. Vale promised in public statements, they said, São Marco, never again. Mariana, never again. We will never let this happen again. 4 years later, a second tailings dam at a Vale mine in Brazil failed. 9.7 million cubic meters of waste flowed down from the mine. It killed 272 people. It buried entire communities. There are videos. You can see this is the picture of the bridge that was washed out. And that area is still struggling to this day, both in terms of the disaster that was left behind, the social and environmental disaster, but also because the mining company is not negotiating in good faith with the victims' families. So people are having to fight the mining company to access remediation, to access reparation, to access some sort of justice 5 years later. So I think those are some really key examples. One more I just want to mention because it happened last week. A tailings failure happened in Turkey and 7 people are missing, right? So it's happening all the time. It's happening all over the globe. It's really dangerous. Earthworks and a number of our partners developed what we consider to be kind of civil society, impacted communities, workers, and indigenous people's response to what we would like to see for safer tailings management. It's a set of 17 guidelines that demand respect for impacted communities, that demand corporate accountability, and that demand safer practices. And I have some handouts if anyone would like to see those that I can share later. Mining is also a climate risk. We've talked about this a bit, but just to put some numbers to it, UNEP estimates that 10% of climate change impacts come from mining and mineral processing. So we're not going to mine our way out of the climate crisis. And then the Global Materials Resource Outlook to 2060 says that 7% of global greenhouse emissions are coming from iron, aluminum, copper, zinc, lead, nickel, and manganese, the so-called critical minerals, right? Mining also disproportionately harms indigenous peoples around the globe. In the US, 68% of our cobalt reserves, 89% of our copper reserves, and 79% of our lithium reserves, also 97% of our nickel reserves are within 35 kilometers of indigenous land, right? So when we talk about onshoring mining to the United States and the US government talks about how we need to do it at home to make sure that we can do it better, the impacts are not being distributed amongst the entire population of the United States. The impacts are continuing to be put forth onto the indigenous people who have suffered years and years and years of exploitation of natural resources at the hand of the US government. And then just to put that in a global context, 75% of our energy transition mineral projects globally are on or near indigenous or peasant lands. So it's happening in the US, but it's also happening around the world. And in the United States, our mining law, which we'll talk about more in the next slide, is from 1872. So it's 150 years old. The goal of our mining law when it was passed was to convince white settlers to move out west to take over the territory, right? So mining was used as part of the colonial project to expropriate land, resources, and territories from indigenous people in the western half of the United States. So that's why the concept of free, prior, informed consent is so important, because indigenous peoples have FPIC as their FPIC, free, prior, informed consent. It's their first line of defense to have sovereignty over their communities, their land, their territories, and their resources. So our organization and the organizations that are here from the United States advocate for free, prior, informed consent for any extraction project. Unfortunately, the US government does not carry out FPIC with Native communities, but it is a key part of our policy push. And that FPIC comes from the rights that are enshrined in the United Nations General Assembly Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So it's been internationally recognized. So a little bit more about US mining regulation and US policy. Like I said, our mining law is from 1872. It's 150 years old. So also when we're talking about, mining in the United States to make sure that there aren't the so-called environmental and social impacts that would happen in other countries, we do not have the protections against those in the United States. That's a myth that the US government promotes. The 1872 mining law has no environmental protections in it. It has no federal royalties. So the federal government of the United States does not make any tax money off any of the mining that happens in the United States. $0. All of those millions and billions of dollars go to the corporations. The federal government gets none of it. Like I said, it doesn't recognize indigenous rights. It doesn't recognize the right to consent from mining impacted communities. And it defines mining as the highest and best use of public lands. So our government says that mining is because it was written in 1872 as a colonial tool, it identifies mining as the best use of land. We have the National Environmental Protection Act, which was passed in the 80s. Don't quote me on the decade. Which does have some provisions to rein in some of the most egregious environmental problems that could be related to mining, but it doesn't require our national our decision makers, so the regulatory agencies that oversee mining, it doesn't require them to select environmentally preferable alternatives or or to prohibit environmentally adverse effects. So if a mine is proposed and we can prove that it is going to pollute the water, let's say, next to the mine, the national government is not required to take that into account when making a decision about whether or not to permit the mine. The outcomes of this in the United States, like I mentioned, 40% of our rivers in the western half of the country are polluted, but there's also 500,000 abandoned mines in the United States. There are half a million abandoned mines scattered across the United States that now the governments, either state or federal, are tasked with cleaning up or maintaining or making sure that they're not impacting local communities, which they can't do. And so the US Environmental Protection Agency estimates that cleanup will cost, and I cut off the bottom, $50 billion. If the US government were going to clean up all the mines in the United States, they would need at least $50 billion. So another thing to think about when we're deciding whether or not to allow a mine. Do we, as our community, does our local government have the money to clean up if something goes wrong? And if not, what's going to happen? What are going to be the long-term impacts of that? So what we're seeing now in the United States, kind of piggybacking off the morning presentations, is that the US government is pushing a policy of electric vehicles as a solution for climate change. And in order to do that, we need to access those raw materials that Diego was explaining this morning in large quantities, right? Switching out our combustion engine cars for electric vehicles in the rapid time frame that we need to avoid climate change, and I'm saying that sarcastically, will require lots of metals and minerals, and our supply chain, like Diego was saying, has a lot of holes and problems. So the US government is promoting policies like you all have heard about here in Europe to onshore mining in the US. One of those is called the Inflation Reduction Act, which is actually Joe Biden, our president's kind of seminal piece of legislation to combat climate change. And it does have some important provisions in it to combat climate change, but it also incentivizes mining in the United States. And what that means is that the federal government is now fast-tracking permits for mines. The first actually fast-track permit just got approved, I believe this week, for a zinc mine in the state of Arizona. And it also gives money to mining companies. And we're going to hear more about that in terms of the Talon mine. But the federal government is directly subsidizing mining in the United States. And it's also trying to subsidize mining around the world. It's created what's called the Mineral Securities Partnership, which is an agreement between the US and 13 countries and the EU to kind of treat these countries as if they were domestic supply so that we can incentivize the mining in other areas. And there's a list of the countries there where we have these partnerships now. So the US government is now sending money abroad to mines in other countries to facilitate production so that we can import it to the United States to meet this demands that the government foresees. Perfect, thank you. And so just kind of, again, piggybacking off what Diego shared with us this morning, this is all being used by the mining industry, this need for critical raw materials and this need for electric vehicles. It's all being used by the mining industry to greenwash and fast-track projects. And, you know, we also have some research. There's great models that Diego shared this morning, but we also have some research that showed that primary material demands can be reduced by 25% with lithium, 35% for cobalt, and 55% for copper if we move away from a one-to-one combustion engine to electric vehicle model and start looking towards public transport, start looking towards recycling, start looking towards design for reuse or design for secondary use. So there are, you know, opportunities and solutions out there. Unfortunately, they're just not being promoted by the US government, and the mining companies are actively trying to undercut those. Also, you know, there are actually now, currently there are oversupply of some of the metals and minerals that we need for these transition energy projects. For example, nickel is oversupplied right now. There's not a shortage of nickel, as there's not a shortage of lithium. And as technologies change, they change very quickly, right? So the electric vehicle battery of today will probably not be the electric vehicle battery of 5 years from now or 10 years from now. It'll use different metals, use different materials, but the mining industry is getting investors on a speculatory boom and bust kind of basis and promoting their mines for these specific metals as the solution. And so we're seeing that across the United States, but obviously we're seeing it globally too. And yeah, greenwashing is the narrative that's being used all across the world to kind of push for this expansion. And then lastly, I just want to, highlight that Earthworks is working with lots of communities that are fighting back. And so we're really excited to be here talking to you and learning from you. We're working with communities that are fighting back against existing mines. So communities that are living downstream from tailings dams who are saying, we want this mining company to relocate us away from the tailings dam so that we're not breathing in the dust every day in our house. We're working with unions to advocate for workers' rights because mine workers, like we heard yesterday, often are facing severe worker rights abuses. And like we saw with those examples of tailings dams failures, usually, unfortunately, the people who die in tailings dam failures are the workers themselves, the people at the mine site. So workers' rights are really important. Transparency and access to information is hugely important, right? A lot of times we work with communities where the mining company says, no, your water's fine, it's not polluted. And we say, okay, can we see the data? Can we see the water quality studies that you've done? And they say, no, we can't share that information. So a big part of what we do is advocate with communities for transparency and access to information, and then advocating for remedy for harm. So communities that have been harmed should have the right to access justice and be able to decide what they want their future to be. And then we work with communities who are fighting to stop mines. And so that includes FPIC for Indigenous peoples, free and prior informed consent, and then it includes the right to say no for non-Indigenous communities who don't want mining in their area. So I will stop there. I think we're gonna see a short video and talk more about the Talon mine example. Thank you.
I think, yeah, now we'll watch a video presentation from Paula Maccabee. She's a hero to us all. She's a rarest kind of creature. She's a lawyer who is also an organizer. She makes the mining industry's blood run cold, and we love her. And she's also a black belt in Taekwondo.
Hello, this is Paula Maccabee, and I am contacting you from Minnesota in the United States. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm going to quickly share with you some of my experience. I've been working with Water Legacy now for 15 years, and we have some really important experience, ideas to share, stories to tell about how to protect water using science, law, and community action. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person. This is always so much more interesting when you can answer questions and have a dialogue. But this way I'll be able to share some information. And if you have questions at the very end of this video, not only is there a QR code so that you can contact Water Legacy, but I've also shared my email so you can ask questions. Water Legacy has worked now in Minnesota for 15 years to prevent new copper, nickel, and lime pollution and harm, to preserve water quality standards, and also to reduce pollution from existing mines. And when we started this work, we really believed that Minnesota was better than everybody else. And we had the good life and the strong regulations and the clean water. And what we've learned through hard experience is that it's not true. Minnesota does not have tough regulations. There are other countries that have much more stringent ones. It's not true that just democratic participation alone will protect waters and communities. I'm going to talk about the Polymet project, which is now wholly owned by Glencore, a notorious multinational corporation. And that project, there were over 100,000 comments opposing the mine. And still, without science and litigation, it was not enough to stop the mine. And then another untruth is that somehow mining is or will be done right in your area. And we learned that that is very much not the case in Minnesota. In Minnesota, existing taconite mines have both weak and unenforced permits. Most of them don't have water quality standards to cover the salient pollutants. And if they do, they're not enforced. And so, and in fact, our Minnesota agencies, and you may see this in your communities as well, if a politically powerful project runs up against a water quality standards, that standard is going to undergo huge pressure to change. And Water Legacy, working in alliance with Native tribes, fought a battle for almost all of our 15 years to prevent the state from rolling back and getting rid of the sulfate standard that protects Monoman wild rice. And then agencies have learned from their political pressure and their legislators and governors to treat the polluters, not the public, as the customers. And what we've also learned is that tribal governments have a particularly important role to play because they're not stakeholders, they're rights holders. And the process of tribal assertion of sovereignty and consultation can make a difference. But the primary lesson we've learned, and I hope this is not, doesn't sound too cynical, but maybe it is is that in order to protect water quality and nature and people, at least in Minnesota, we have had to go to the courts and we've had to rely on federal oversight. And the closer the government is to a place and a scale where political pressure can be exerted and financial pressure, the more likely it is that people in the communities are going to have to not only organize, but take this to a higher level and maybe to the courts as well. Now, here's some images showing what are the consequences of regulatory failure. There's a picture of a Mintac mine. That is one of the mines that has had absolutely decades and decades of non-enforcement and agreements with the agency to stop polluting to no avail. The map on the top, all those red lines are impaired waters. And in the state of Minnesota, there are more than 6,000 lakes or stretches of rivers and streams that are contaminated at a level that is greater than what is necessary to protect water, aquatic life, and human health. And then this picture in the bottom, this is these straggly little dead-looking plants in the water. That is the remnants of monomen or sin in the Lakota language and the Ojibwe language. Monomen is the Ojibwe. That is the remnants of wild rice that used to be abundant and has been destroyed by an excessive mining pollution, primarily sulfate. And this is another example of just ways to understand how sulfide ore mining can affect the environment. And we call copper, nickel, cobalt, manganese mining all sulfide ore mining because these metals are bound up with the sulfate, with the sulfide ore. And so when the sulfide ore is dug out of the ground and pulverized, sulfate forms in contact with water, and also sulfur dust is released to the air. And this orange stream here is the result of acid mine drainage. Another important contribution of sulfate is the contamination, the increasing the methylation of mercury and bioaccumulation, resulting in contamination of fish. Sulfide mining also in Minnesota would result in a huge destruction of peatlands and wetlands that sequester carbon, thereby contributing to climate crisis. And this last picture is a picture that took place in Canada a few years ago when a mining dam collapsed and just released all the stored tailings and wastewater, contaminating a huge plume downstream. Now, here's our mercury and fish picture. They've done studies of, it's basically a scientific consensus that adding sulfate to areas that are already contaminated with fish will increase mercury release from the sediments, mercury conversion to methylmercury, which is the kind that reacts with organic people and organic fish and organic bugs and insects. And the level of mercury in fish can be sometimes 1 million times higher as a result of biomagnification. And the other important thing to realize in Minnesota, this is a signature species of incredible importance to tribal culture and also to the ecology as a whole, the mammals and the fish that rely on wild rice and the wild birds, the ducks and geese that eat monomen when they migrate. And sulfate also will decimate wild rice primarily by affecting the seeds and doing so through the root uptake of nutrients. And so we have to realize that if copper nickel mining is proposed, and this is sulfide mining, that release of acid mine drainage and leaching of toxic metals such as arsenic and lead, and increased release of nutrients, excessive nutrients from lake bottoms, and release of mercury and biomagnification of mercury. This is inherent in the mining process. And the more ore, because the ores are bound up with sulfide rock, the more ore, the more of a threat of sulfide. And this is just an experience. This is a report that was done in the United States, but is verifiable the world over, that every sulfide mine in a water-rich environment, streams and wetlands, has polluted surface water and or groundwater with acid mine drainage and or toxic metals. So how do we actually manage to pressure agencies and get control and stop the pollution or prevent the pollution from mining? And the answer is knowing this kind of science and then pairing it up with your states, your countries' legal standards, and then fighting to make sure that mines that will scientifically cause harm and do violate legal standards are not issued permits, and that existing mines are forced to comply with the standards necessary to protect water and nature and people. Now, the Polymet mine, when we started this work as Water Legacy in 2009, we were told by everyone that the Polymet mine was inevitable, the deal had already been cut, that the area where the mine was going to be located was a brownfield zone, is basically a sacrifice zone. And you can see on your, in the corner, the right-hand corner of this imagery, that is me and a few of our board members, and we canoed up this very small sinuous river, the Partridge River, to the mine site. And what we learned, and you can see this to some extent in this image, this was a very rich, biodiverse area that is by no means a brownfield site. The mine site is a site of wetlands, and actually a site where some of the plants that are important to indigenous people as medicine grow naturally there. So this is a site worth protecting. So one of the first lessons, and this is a part where community participation and storytelling and videos are important, is to identify that where a mine company, where a multinational corporation is proposing to put a mine in place, is not a sacrifice zone, that is valuable as a part of nature and valuable for human beings. Now, the Polymet mine, the permits were approved for this mine in November and December of 2018. All these years later, and I'm talking to you in February of 2024, the three major permits on which this mine has depended have either been reversed or revoked. The Polymet water permit was revoked this August in 2023. Water Legacy had worked with whistleblowers on the advice of some of our tribal allies and exposed irregular procedures and secrecy, where our state agency convinced political players at the federal level to suppress the evidence of its scientists that the permit would be so weak it would violate state and tribal standards. And we managed to get a hearing and a trial, and all this kind of proof came in. And finally, this summer, the Minnesota Supreme Court reversed the water pollution permit, saying that the approval of that permit was arbitrary and capricious. Another important reversal was back in 2022. A lot of community people had asked for a contested case hearing because the strategies that Polymet was proposing to control its waste, its reactive mine waste at the tailings basin, were completely unproven. And the court granted that and referred the case back for a contested case hearing. And then the administrative law judge ruled this summer, or actually ruled late this fall, that the proposal by Polymet would not meet the requirements of Minnesota's reactive mine waste rule. Basically, the pollution would get it into the water, and that was not allowed by the rule. And we're still in the process of seeing whether the department will agree with this recommendation of the administrative law judge. But once again, the permit was reversed. And so all the time while this discussion is happening, while the science and the law are being tested, there has been no mining, there's been no pollution, there's been no destruction of wetlands. And here's a very important lesson from the Polymet mine. And this is the first time that any downstream state in America, whether it's a state like Wisconsin or Iowa, or a tribal nation that has been granted, quote unquote, treatment as a state under the Clean Water Act. This was the first time that any downstream state had exercised the authority to object to a federal permit. And what happened is the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, had gotten treatment as a state for water quality standards way back in 1998. And they exercised their right to say the Polymet project, which was going to affect wetlands, a combination of the many ways that Polymet would add sulfate and other toxic chemicals and increase mercury contamination, would violate the Fond du Lac ban's downstream tribal water quality standards. And the United States Environmental Protection Agency agreed with that assessment as a matter of science. And the Army Corps, which actually is supposed to listen to the governments like the tribes and the EPA that really know something about water quality standards, finally agreed and concluded this past summer that the Polymet mine would violate the downstream Fond du Lac ban's reservation water standards. And so it could not be approved. And so the Army Corps revoked the permit. Now, Polymet has said they're going to push forward, but looking at the track record of reverse permits and revoked permits, this is a very significant victory. It's now 15 years after Polymet was claiming this project would be in the ground, and it hasn't moved forward. Now, we still need to be vigilant because these corporations have very large pools of money, but this is a substantial achievement supported by community activism and participation and communications, and based on science and law, which is really where the heart of this dispute comes down to. It's not just that we are opposed to it, but demonstrating that a project would harm people, harm water, harm nature, and finding a legal way to get access to proof and demonstrate those facts. Now, Minnesota is unfortunately located on a significant part of the mid-continent rift in the United States. And that means there are a number of locations where there's a potential for mining, sulfide ore mining and iron ore mining. And these pictures all reflect the risks of a new proposal by Talon Metals and Rio Tinto to mine in the Aitkin County or Tamarack area. This photo on the top left is Tamarack area wetlands. The photo in the middle, this beautiful canoeing photo, is the downstream St. Croix River. There's a picture of a beautiful dock and lake in the Savannah Portage. And this picture on the bottom, if you're not familiar with how this is done, this is a really abundant wild rice area. And it's so abundant that it's not possible to canoe through this area. But instead, the harvesters use poles and then they knock the grain into their canoes. And these are just some of the important waters, wetlands, wild rice resources, nature that would be threatened by a Talon Metals Rio Tinto nickel mine. And now here's a few, I'm giving you a very quick view of what's at stake and what are some of the tricks that Talon and Rio Tinto are playing. And the first trick is to try and make sure that the environmental review of the project is inadequate. And these pictures, both the one on the left and the one in the middle, are both from Talon Metals. And you can see that they have admitted that their present deposit is 0.1%, less than 1% of the total area that they believe is the Tamarack intrusive complex, the entire body of that ore. And yet that is what they're coming forward with. They put in their first papers, their first submittal last summer in 2023, saying, we want an environmental review just of this itty bitty tiny plan. And then their own chief external affairs officer explained, we can push this mine in the permitting process and hopefully get a permit while we're also exploring for additional nickel resources in Minnesota. And Talon has called this a district scale mineral resource. So they're basically proposing that environmental review science is done on a bait and switch basis. And the bait and switch is that we only find out the harm of a very tiny area, and our plan from the beginning is to mine and affect a much bigger area, including the water resources that were described in the prior slide. And they're proposing 225 acres of underground mining, and they have admitted they control 31,000 acres of mine leases. And even though there has been no feasibility study for their teeny plan, no permits, no environmental analysis, and no tribal consent, they have already obtained huge multi-million, hundreds of millions in subsidies from the federal government in the United States to build a processing plant in North Dakota and to continue their exploration of mining. So this is a situation that we are now working very hard, and we're working in alliance with community organizers in the local community, with faith-based groups and conservation groups downstream, and also in alliance with the tribal communities, primarily the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, which is the most directly affected, its waters, its airshed, and its lands by this proposed mine. So what are we saying that is important as you go forward, as you think about dealing both with existing legacy pollution and with proposed additional mining? Our strategy involves expert scientific reports. Sometimes these are paid experts, sometimes these are retired professionals. And that environmental review and practically any work you want to do to demonstrate to people that there is going to be harm or has already been harm depends on the science. Similarly, environmental review in the United States is supposed to be about the science. And what we've learned is you've got to get it right from the beginning. If you want to later argue that there's harm caused by a project, it's important to get the science right and the environmental review right. And then I can't emphasize enough that tribal alliances are critical. Tribal alliances are critical because tribes are rights holders, not just stakeholders. And that there is has been a huge upswing in tribal exercise of sovereignty, and their stewardship of the resources is very important. And the participation of non-tribal allies is, whether it's faith groups, conservation groups, civic groups, is essential to avoid the ability of those in power or those advocating for mine to isolate tribal governments and tribal members and say it's only their problem, when in fact, it's the entire community's problem. It's the downstream community's problem. It's the problem of every living being that is associated in that area, and it's a problem of human health, particularly usually the health of children. So it's important to use downstream and local organizing to transmit the science, to support the tribes, and also to provide, I have to say, agency oversight, court oversight. These are still human beings. And if the first time they've heard about your case is when you get into court, you're in a much different position than if the community and the media and the strategy has already made a lot of the controversy in science known. And I think in this communication, it is important not just to do the dry science, though I love the dry science, but to communicate the value of preservation, the value of health, the value of culture, the value of preserving our world for at least the next 7 generations that come after us. And then all these wonderful things aside, Water Legacy's message to anyone in America or in other countries is always plan for litigation. And so as you're assembling your science, as you're going through any environmental review process, as you're engaging your community members, always think that if push comes to shove, is there any way that the laws of your land can permit a decision that prevents or cleans up or holds liable the mining companies that have damaged water or are planning to damage water and nature and human health? Now, I'm sorry I cannot be there to have a dialogue. I would love to have one. But if you have questions, please feel free to send me an email, paula@waterlegacy.org. And I've also been advised that this lovely little, it looks like a maze to me, but it's actually a QR code that if you scan it with your phone, That will put you on Water Legacy's homepage where you can learn more, and you can also sign up to get more information. So thank you all so very much. It was lovely talking with you, and I hope you've managed to take away something that will help, that our stories and our experience will help you in your struggle. Thank you so much.
Well, that to me is a powerful reminder that the seemingly impossible can be achieved, something we must never lose sight of. Now I think we want to cue up Shanai's presentation.
I guess I could just kind of
just rip into it.
It'll appear up there with a security alert. No. So I will try to speak slowly, and I will also try to be brief because we've been sitting for a while and we really do want to have a conversation. It's such an honor to be here. My name is Shanai. I am from the community, one of the communities that Paula spoke about, where Rio Tinto and Talon Metals are proposing to build a massive nickel mine. So we heard a lot of technical information, legal information, and policy information, but now we're going to talk about grassroots organizing and culture. And I think of myself as an artist, but also as a cultural organizer. So I think about the ways that the specific local culture where these proposals are happening influences our strategies as organizers. And so I'm going to share with you just a little bit about the local community where Rio Tinto is here in Minnesota. And then I'm gonna talk about it as it is today, but also share a little bit of historical information that is a context for this. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the organizing strategies that are emerging among a collective of people. So I'm one organizer. I work with a number of organizations. I kind of work between Native communities and local rural communities, and also between urban communities of activists and movement folks, and then the rural community where I come from. We'll share some strategies that we found or that we're finding, and hopefully that'll cue us up for some stories. We brought along some video voices from our communities to share with you. So this first slide is just a recent headline from MIT Tech Review. It says, "This town's mining battle reveals the contentious path to a cleaner future." So this is really how, in the United States, the Talon Metals Rio Tinto mine and many other energy transition mines are being framed by the media. That it's up to us in our little towns to decide the future of the energy transition. And yet, how much do we actually get to know the information, and how much rights do we have as local communities to say no? So this is another map, just for those of you who aren't familiar with the geography of the United States. The little star there is approximately where I'm talking about. So that is the community that I come from, and that red line is the Mississippi River. So we are directly on the Mississippi River, which flows all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Millions of people get their drinking water from the Mississippi River. And this is where Rio Tinto and Talon Metals want to put a toxic nickel mine. Another important thing to know about the community, specifically where Rio Tinto is proposing to mine nickel, very recently, just 2 years ago, roughly, time is very bendy, we were engaged in a struggle against an oil pipeline company. Enbridge Energy was successful in building a tar sands pipeline to transport oil through our community. And myself and thousands of others, really, led by Indigenous people from this area, came together to try to intervene in what was predicted to be a destructive oil pipeline, and which turned out to be very destructive. There was a lot of focus on the potential of an oil spill, But really, a lot of the damage from this pipeline actually happened in construction. They were working in wet areas. Paula showed you some of the pictures. When you're working underground in wet areas and you're moving water and you're moving land, you're impacting the ecosystem. So we fought a pipeline. We lost that battle. But there was a lot of organizing that happened. And also, many of us had interactions with local law enforcement and others in our struggles that now come into play as Rio Tinto comes to town. I have this little video in here. I don't know if it's going to play. I'll try. If it does, it's 1 minute long. I know many of you are very familiar with Rio Tinto, but in case you're not, we'll see if this works. And maybe, oh, nope, it's not going to work. But basically, this is a video about how Rio Tinto plunders and destroys all over the world. When we learned that Rio Tinto was the mining company coming to our community, we did some research, and that's actually what led us here. We were aware of the struggle here in Serbia, and it was very inspiring to us because we saw the photos of massive amounts of people. We heard about the project being stopped. I know that there's more nuance to it than that, but it was just know that it was very inspiring to us. The community where Rio Tinto proposes to work is not new. Mining is nothing new. So as Paula mentioned, we have an existing iron ore and taconite mining industries. This is a picture of what it looks like today, just north of where we are. But this is open pit iron mining, which is not hard rock sulfide mining. It's a very different type of mining, but it does have an ecological footprint, and the communities here already deal with the pollution impacts from those mines and the fact that our government does not enforce regulation. I put two pictures here. These are pictures from our historical society. I don't know who these people are specifically, but it is important that this area also, you mentioned this, Jan, mining law and mining in general was part of the United States settler colonial project. So this area was opened up for settlement, and many people came from all over the world, and a lot of people came from this part of the world to the region to work in the mines and to also cut lumber. And my family is one of those families. My grandfather is from this region. And so, there's a lot of connectivity between our communities as well, having to do with the migration of people and settlement. I'm trying to remember why I put this slide in here. I think it was to mention that you might hear this as the history of the United States, but it's only the settler history. It's the settler colonial history. We say now this is the so-called United States, and we are in occupied Anishinaabe territory. But that is not something that most of the settlers in our community say, right? Instead, what they say is what our former president has said, which is that this is our way of life. Extraction is our way of life. It's our right. And the person to the right of Trump, criminal, is our congressman. His name is Pete Stauber, and he ran on a platform of supporting mining, and he said it's our way of life. That's his slogan. And the people in the community who support mining, they use slogans like, we support mining because mining supports us. And this narrative is very strong. And it's part of what we're organizing around when we're in our local communities. And it also completely erases, of course, the indigenous people who are still here and have been resisting this kind of colonialism since contact with colonizers. So I put this slide in here to talk about how, this, if I go back one, Trump and mining supports us is one playbook in support of mining. This is another one. So this is on the other side, right? President Biden, through some of the mechanisms that Jan mentioned, like the Inflation Reduction Act and spending from our Department of Energy and Department of Defense, are now saying that mining is part of our green future. They're greenwashing. And what I think they're also doing is green grifting. It's a con. So it is about convincing people that the mines are safe and that we can do it better, but it's also about extracting money from the US government and from investors while they can. So the price of nickel is now dropping, but for a while the price of nickel was high, and it had to do with war, and it had to do also with speculation. And so they're using all of this to convince investors that they're going to be able to mine safely. But I think they actually know they can't do it. And so it's sort of like a race to see how much they can get away with while the market's hot. And what does that look like in practice? So what does that look like on the ground? And so now I'm going to talk about Talon Metals. So Talon Metals is a company that, we say Talon Metals Rio Tinto because Rio Tinto owns just enough to be not the majority of Talon Metals. They're 49% owners of the nickel project called the Tamarack project. That was pretty recent that they sold just enough shares so that Talon, a new company, which is based in the British Virgin Islands, a tax shelter, they're not an American company, but that they could be the majority owner and they could get subsidies from the United States government. This is a picture of the Tesla that Talon Metals drives around our rural community. And it's covered in these images of forests and clean water. These are all things that are familiar to people in Minnesota. They're things we cherish. It's part of our identity. And they say that this car is powered by nickel. And they've actually trademarked, which is a way of protecting like a logo or a image. They've trademarked green nickel. Even though green nickel is just nickel. But they talk about green nickel and they put it on their car. And something important to know about the community is that I believe they were for a while maybe the only owners of a Tesla in the entire county, because it's a very poor area. You know, there are vacation people there, but people aren't driving around in fancy cars. And electric vehicles, you know, well, most of us drive the cars until they can't be driven anymore. You know, yeah. So this is a map that shows a little bit more close-up of the mine proposed site. So you see that black line across the top. That's the oil pipeline I mentioned, and very near to the oil pipeline are a number of lakes. And those lakes are really important because, as others have mentioned, this is one of the only places on the continent that monomen or wild rice grows still, and abundantly. And it's also an area where a lot of people live close to the water. You can see some pictures. This is what it looks like. These are wetlands. These are globally rare peatlands. All of these ecosystems are water rich and they're very sensitive to changes in water. So just a little bit of mine pollution could decimate these ecosystems. It would kill wild rice. It would also potentially kill these peatlands, which would release carbon. So the idea that we're going to mine to solve climate change, but will destroy our carbon sequestering peatlands in the process is kind of one of these contradictions. And this is a billboard that was put up by one of the nearby towns where natural wonders never cease, but it just shows you this idea that this is a place of natural wonder and beauty, and yet we want to destroy it with a nickel mine for Tesla. Let's see. And this is what the town of Tamarack, which is the town nearest to the proposed mine, looks like. It only has 90 people living in the town. And many of them are employees now of the mining company. They're exploratory drilling, and they have been for 20 years. Rio Tinto, Kennecott, and now Talon Metals. But it's an area that doesn't have a lot of people. It doesn't have a lot of young people. A lot of people leave. I left as soon as I could, because there wasn't work and I couldn't see a future for myself. And so there's also a nostalgia of people wanting their people to return, and thinking that maybe if we can open a mine, we might have jobs and we might have something to attract people back. And this is a picture. This was from that same MIT article, just kind of showing you sort of some of the
just interesting messaging that you see around. And I put this slide in here again to remind us about the importance of wild rice for Anishinaabe people, but also just what it tells you about how central this area is. So that dark red, that's which has the most wild rice trips. And that is also where the mine is proposed. The county is called Aiken County. I'm going to cruise through here because I know I'm taking longer than I wanted to. So this is a picture of Sandy Lake, which is a lake where Rio Tinto and Talon Metals want to discharge their mine waste, the water, into a ditch that would flow into this lake. They say they're shipping their mine waste to North Dakota, which is another part of their greenwashing plan. But the water from the mine would go here. This lake is, it has a lot of recreation, and it has a lot of people who have cabins and second homes. So there is a lot of interesting class dynamics in the community, which if we want to, we can talk more about. But it's also the site of the Sandy Lake tragedy. And I brought some pamphlets along that you can take with you if you read English and you want to learn more. But this is important because the Sandy Lake tragedy in 1851, the United States government at that time tried to force Anishinaabe people from underneath of Lake Superior in that area to go to Sandy Lake to get annuity payments. They promised them if they came to that area right before winter time, that they would get their annuity payments, which were part of the negotiations that the U.S. government these were not fair negotiations. There's a lot you could say. But what happened was some people did come to Sandy Lake, and it was a brutal time of year, a very, very difficult time of year. And the U.S. government then withheld those annuity payments and food, and people were starved and they were sickened, and hundreds of Anishinaabe people died at Sandy Lake. So it's called the Sandy Lake tragedy, and it was directly related to mining and extraction at that time, because the people are on the land, that is in the way of the mining company. And so this is just an example of historic colonization in the name of mining and industry. And this is the same pattern now that Rio Tinto is taking in the name of so-called green energy. And so how do we organize in this context? There's a lot going on here. Myself and a handful of other local residents were part of founding an organization called Tamarack Water Alliance, which is really just a group of local people who are concerned about the mine and want to share information with our neighbors. And also we want to talk to experts like scientists, lawyers, policymakers, so that we can know as much as we can know about it and be able to organize together. So this is just a picture of a booth that we set up at all kinds of community fairs. We try to go wherever the mining company goes. So you can see their booth and you can see our booth. And then we had these yard signs made. And it's the kind of community where the messaging is not as direct as it might be in some places. But the idea that it's too risky resonated with people. This is Alan at one of our booths, just to show you that we do go lots of places. We try to be where people are and talk to them and share good information. We also have community events where we share food and conversation. And this has been a really important way of connecting in the local community. We found out during the oil pipeline struggle that, always being right there with a message of opposition doesn't work always to bring people in and start conversation. So we use a different way here. And we also work with science. So Paula mentioned how important it is to work with scientists. We work with scientists who are in a kind of colonial science, and also with indigenous scientists. And we go to the reservation communities, and we go to the churches and the small town banquets and talk to people about the impacts that the mine would have on their health.
And I just put this here to mention that idea of unlikely alliances. So this is a book that was written by one of the people who was in the mine struggle that Alan mentioned, about Native nations and white communities joining together to defend rural lands. So that's really the recipe, so to speak, of what we are trying to do here as well. And so this is a picture of some of the things that we do to organize culturally on the ground. So this is a picture from a wild rice harvesting camp that we had, where we were working with Anishinaabe people. We were learning together how to harvest wild rice. And just to show you some pictures of what that looks like, it was really just a way to spend time together out on the water and on the land. And to be, as organizers, you know, we spend a lot of time in meetings or in our heads. And so to be out on the water together is a really beautiful way to build our relationships and sustain ourselves. And then this is Leanna Goose. She's an organizer who is Anishinaabe from the Leech Lake Band, and she also was teaching us how to replant monomen. So we were learning not just how to take the gift of wild rice, but also how we can be part of replanting it so that the next generations can survive. And that was a really beautiful lesson for all of us. And then this is just to show that we're not just doing this kind of haphazardly. We're also thinking really strategically about who we're engaging. So on the left is a circle of people, and those were mostly young organizers and activists who live in the city. And we bring them to the rural community to spend time with us so that they are able to understand our struggles. They can meet indigenous people and learn from them. And then on the other side is an artist, Rory Wakemup. He was one of the people who was leading the wild rice camp. And then in the canoe is one of our state senators. So she's a politician. She identifies as an indigenous woman, Lakota, but she came out to go ricing, and we were able to talk about policy together while we were out on the water. And the other thing that happens when you're on the ground and you're working in these ways is that you see things that you wouldn't see if you were just working on your computer in the city. This is a picture of where Talon Metals and Rio Tinto are dumping tailings from their drilling behind some trees that you can't see it from the road, but we know people who have drones who are able to help take a look from above and see what they're doing. And then I think this might be one of the last couple of examples, but this is an art project. So I mentioned that I'm an artist. One of my projects was to build a mine view. So at mine sites, you can walk up and look in the binoculars, and they celebrate what the mine has produced. So we made one of these that sits on the back of a pickup truck. And then we can take it to the mining company picnic and park it and give our own tours. And so this is a picture of people who are coming to hear the mining company propaganda, but before they got to the picnic, they stopped to look at the information that we were sharing and some pictures that we had put on these little viewfinders. And then we also drove it to their drill site and parked it outside their drill site. And this is a mining engineer who has become part of our resistance, sharing his experiences working in the industry. So that idea of unlikely alliances is also really important. And I think I'm almost done. And then, yeah, and so we're also producing printed media because not everybody's on the internet. We don't even have internet in the community very good, you know, so we're making things now that we can distribute. And then, you know, pushing back against the greenwashing is really, really important early. That's something that we're learning, is that when the mining company is trying to co-opt the climate movement, or they're trying to convince people who are environmentalists that this mining is green and this mining is good, we have to show up there and make sure that those others who might be our allies understand that it is lies, that it is greenwashing. And so these are just some pictures of some demonstrations that folks in our community have done. On the left side, the woman with the striped shirt works for the mining company. She's a local person that they've hired to be their government relations person. And she has a background in science. So she's able to go out and say, well, I have a background in science and I'm a mother and I live here. I would never do anything to hurt our community. And so that's how they do it. And so we need to be there to remind people that it isn't even about being green. It's about greed. It's about profit. And then on the other side, that's Johnny. And we made these posters and we participated in a climate march. And you would be surprised how many people at this climate march did not like our message about the mines. They thought that, I think somebody said to us directly, they said, oh, this is about climate change. Why are you, like, why are you talking about mining? And so that's just to say we have a lot of work to do in building that awareness across movement. And then I think the last thing I'll just say is that, you know, indigenous leaders around the world are starting to speak about green colonialism, about the idea that this is an extension of colonialism, and the solutions are land back. And land back doesn't just mean indigenous people owning land, because that's a colonial concept. But the idea of relationship back, and the idea of lifting up all of those important relationships as part of a solution. And I don't need to go through these too much, but I brought materials if anybody wants to get website info. Tamarack Water Alliance, the organization that we founded locally, we do a monthly meeting online, and anybody can Zoom in. So any of you could attend one of our meetings, and actually our next meeting is Ricky, who's going to speak today on the final panel, will be joining us. Mille Lacs Band, which Paula mentioned, they have a campaign about the Rio Tinto and Talon mine, water over nickel. And Honor the Earth, the organization that many of us have worked with, has a campaign around stopping green colonialism. So these are all things that you can check out. So I think now Johnny is going to share a couple of videos. And I know we've been sitting for a long time, but I hope we can just sit for a few more minutes to hear from some of the communities near Rio Tinto mines, and hear about some of the work Johnny's doing to map stories. And you have to, oh, you got it. You have to wear the mic.
Richardson, Lawrence.
Okay.
I'm from the Red Lake
Okay.
Nation.
So,
Big Rice Lake, just south of McGregor, north of Mille Lacs. There's many surrounding tribal nations here that harvest wild rice from this lake. I've been ricing for 3 years. That's a very small amount compared to the generations my family's been here.
This monomen. So this is pure wild rice. You know, it's pure, and only the Anishinaabe can harvest off of there. That was promised to us in our Collier Agreement from 1935.
What draws me to the lake is the ability to feed my family and others, harvesting wild rice for the winter so we have sustenance to keep us fed. Possible threats would be mining and pipelines. Mining and pipelines can bring unknown materials into the lake and surrounding rivers and ecosystems that could drain directly into the Big Rice Lake. I want to keep this lake protected for the generations to come.
You know, like I said, you know, the people in Washington, they're not, you know, they're only concerned about, you know, the money. You know, I gifted them monomen, you know, when I was there, you know, to show them, you know, hey, this is what we're fighting to protect. It's just really irritating, you know, that they push it aside, you know. It just makes me think, you know, that the administration already has their mind set. They haven't been here to see our critical mineral is the monomen, you know. It's critical to our to our customs, to our traditions, our cultural identity. The sulfur and sulfates and everything, it's just going to decimate, you know, this wild rice, you know, this monomen. We have a covenant to protect it.
So that was a little video of ricing, actual ricing on Rice Lake, which is now a federal reserve, a wildlife reserve. That's Jean Skinaway, who is the chairperson of the Sandy Lake Band, and her son, ricing. And as they said, you know, it's not only a spiritual thing for them to rice, but it's an economic driver. It feeds them through the winter. It's a very critical
green energy transition
element of their life. So we're going to transition into a video. So my story is this. I came to northern Minnesota to fight Line 3 as a frontline activist. I didn't bring video equipment. I didn't bring my camera. And it was obvious that media was needed. We needed more people to learn about what was happening with Line 3. And then immediately after, we have this fight with Rio Tinto that's just really starting up. And Shanai and I talked about, like, how can we engage people? And as we've discussed yesterday, and a lot of people brought up, the narrative, the stories of people on the ground that are affected by these extraction projects is critical. So for the last 2 years, I've been collecting stories from people around our project, but this is down in Thacker Pass, which is in Nevada. There's a lithium mine proposal that's actually, since this video has been made, has moved forward, and they've started developing the mine. All the legal venues have been stopped. I mean, it looks like this mine is going to go through. There's still some legal lanes they can try, but it looks like they're going to be building this mine. But we're going to be hearing from Gary McKinney, who's a person who represents the people of Red Mountain. He's a Duck Valley Reservation tribal member. And from that video, we're going to jump right down to Arizona, where the Oak Flat mine is proposed. It's a Rio Tinto mine that involved a land transfer from the federal government to the mining company that would transfer land that's a sacred site for the Apache people in Arizona. So the Apache people sued the government, and it's gotten to the full appeals court of the Ninth Circuit. There hasn't been a resolution yet. There hasn't been a judgment. But we're gonna go from listening to Gary to a man named Wensler Nossi, who is the former chairperson of the Apache people in Arizona, and now he's an activist and a leader of the Apache Stronghold, and they're protecting their sacred site in Arizona from Resolution Copper, which is also Rio Tinto. So we're going to hear from them. And then there's a little bit of redundancy, because at the very end, we're going to hear Jean Skinaway again, really talking about the things she talked about in that video. So we can go ahead and proceed now.
Portrayed as something that is going to save us from a climate crisis, but the crisis itself is posed by the capitalism, colonialism, and extractivism. Those are the three things that are pushing. But, you know, we can't fix dirty mining with more dirty mining. And everyone knows that, you know, lithium batteries, lithium is supposed to be good, but nobody knows about the 1.7 billion gallons of water a year for the next 41 years. And no one knows about the abandoned mines that's already by our reservations that's been giving us cancer. You know, how come those things don't make it to the table? This whole system that we're living in isn't healthy, and it's not good. If you have to lie, if you have to cheat, and if you have to steal to get it, it's not right. It's not good for nobody. And that's what they're doing to us. They're lying to our people. They're cheating our people. They're stealing from our people. They're greenwashing, and they're saying, you know what, this green energy transition is going to save us all from a lot of heartache. But really, it's not. It's going to get them a lot of money, and that's green. That's green to them. That's their idea of green. Why did we forget about talking about the atrocious things? Because America wasn't always good. They stole this land from the Native American people and moved us up out of the way and continued to bring genocide upon us. And so to this day, we recognize that and we're resisting that. We're not going to let these things go because we're survivors of these things.
Our struggle's your struggle. You know, our fight is your fight. And it's well said here. I don't know how else to make it clear to all of you. So now you know what they do to everybody else. They're doing that to Native American people. And if it happens here, can you imagine around the world? When the United States claims to be the country of discipline, respect, and yet we are the ones that are victims behind closed doors. But now you all Americans have joined us. You're all victims to this corporate world. So now let's stand up, because we're the ones that put them there. We're the ones that can take them out and start electing real leaders that would take care of this country and the rest of the world. And I always told you all, let's go back to the first chapter. All those things they said never meant a damn thing. To this day, it still doesn't. No conscience.
This company, Rio Tinto, whatever their subsidiary might be here, that's a record. And I've been hearing my Republican colleagues talk about we've got to open up mining and everything because of child labor, environmental degradation, human rights violations. This is what happens in those places. And that's why America has to be energy independent, because we do it the right way. Well, let's talk about those values. Rio Tinto, subsidized by the Chinese government, primarily foreign owned, doesn't pay 1 penny of royalties for what they extract from our public lands and export. 78% is exported. And what have they done? Environmental degradation, child labor, human rights violation, destroying a 40,000-year-old international heritage site, and the list goes on.
Our critical mineral is the monument. You know, it's critical to our customs, to our traditions, our cultural identity. We have a covenant to protect it. The fact is, they haven't been here, so it's just really frustrating that this administration just seems that they already have their mindset.
Final video is from Honduras. We went on a delegation because they have several mining catastrophes there as well. We went on a delegation to Honduras to learn about mining, and this is a little video from Wapinol.
Ya, ok. Bueno, me llamo Gabriela Sorto, de Wapinol. Soy parte del comité de la comunidad y también parte del comité municipal en defensa de los bienes comunes y públicos de Tocó. Bueno, estamos a la orilla de este hermoso río, un río Wapinol, el cual lo amo porque soy nacida en esta comunidad. Tengo 28 años y soy nacida acá y he crecido viendo estas aguas tan hermosas. Comiendo de los peces de este río, el cual nos han sustentado a las familias de los que vivimos acá. Y creo que mi lucha por la defensa de este río es justa, y por esa montaña maravillosa que está atrás de mis espaldas también. Y bueno, tengo cómo amarlo y cómo agradecerle todo lo que nos ha dado y que nos sigue dando a las comunidades, a pesar de que poco a poco está secando, pero sigue con vida porque nosotros estamos luchando por él y lo amamos y lo cuidamos y lo vamos a seguir luchando hasta donde podamos. Gracias.
So what we're hoping to do with these videos, and this is where you all come in, this is my pitch. We're collecting these stories. We're gonna make a story map, and we're gonna have the extraction projects on a map, and then we're gonna have the voices of the people that are standing in resistance to these extraction projects. So if any of you would like to take a 2-minute bit of your time this evening or tomorrow perhaps to talk about what's happening in your communities. We don't have the story map up and running yet, but like I said, we're on the cusp. We're waiting for some technical help in the software. But we would love to gather any stories, anybody who would like to participate, and eventually we're going to have a story map up, and you'd be able to click on Serbia and the community, and then we could hear your voices and we could talk, you know, there'd be information about the project that's coming to your community or threatening your community, and you'd be able to talk about why it's so important to resist. So that's open to anybody who would like to participate. And yeah, I think we were talking yesterday about tools for communication and narrative and how to share these stories, and I think that this would be a really useful way that we could all participate. So
We're at time. If we want to go a little over and get some questions, but if we don't have time, then just thank you for listening to us. So.
Yeah.
Jel ovo radi? Čujemo se. Ako neko želi da postavi pitanja, može da postavi. Ja ću da budem mali od palube za mikrofon, tako da, eto.
Pretpostavljam na srpskom, da. Kako ste proslavljali male pobede i kako proslavljate male pobede?
How small?
How do you feel them?
Sometimes we celebrate the smallest of victories.
Yeah. Anyone want to go for it? I don't have a victory celebration that I do all the time, but I do think it is important to celebrate those victories, even if it's just with your friends and your associates and your family, just to be able to motivate yourself. And you know, we do that in small ways all the time, just to keep ourselves motivated.
I'll say, you know, if we win something small, I will do this. I'll go,
But I don't know about bigger victories, like we talked about the polymet mine. I don't know if you have.
I mean, that's an enormous victory. And we can only marvel because.
Okay, sorry. No, you speak but we heard the translation at the same time because your headphones are.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't hear that then. Maybe I'll just say, so recently, like I shared, we stopped a proposed nickel mine in the town next to mine, and the local brewery built a big structure out of wood that emulated what mining machinery looks like, and then we lit it on fire and drank beer.
You told us that a lot of it's working. Okay, you told us that a lot of future sites, mining sites, are in 35-kilometer radius close to native indigenous population territories. Is it by chance, or are mining companies just specifically looking for ore there?
I don't think it's by chance. Ricky could probably speak to this later this evening when he's on the panel also, but there's been a history of pushing Native people off their lands in the United States and pushing them further and further west. And so it's been part of a strategy of colonization to push indigenous people into certain parts of the country, which just now happen to be some of the places where there are these very important deposits. So it was a long strategy of settler colonialism that has now turned into the close proximity because of the types of land where people have been pushed to.
So we have here 3 more questions. We can wait for all of them to ask, and then it's easier that way, maybe. Yeah.
It's a comment, but maybe there is like an open something at the end. For the first time today, I had this picture of like multinational companies, and then just like in an abusive relationship in family, this kind of isolation that you feel. And like, am I crazy because of something that you're suffering from the abuser? And I felt, because I spoke with Shanai a little bit before this panel, I felt really the importance of knowing that you are not the only one being bullied in that exactly same systematic way, that it's really, so I had this, and I'm glad that Jerry now joined and proposed this map for our stories, because that's exactly something that can be empowering and healing. I was thinking of this, not multinational companies, but this nation of people, communities and landscapes that have been severely wounded by one company or the system that is doing something in this way. So I was thinking, like, I really like this invitation that Shanai gave for this monthly meeting. It would be nice if someone from Nedeljice or from Stara Planina would join, and if there is some kind of exchange. But I also think that this kind of map of stories can be something that is, so it's nice if it stays by the organizer, something that we receive as an invitation, because that can be built through time. Not just to collect stories, but anyhow, stories can be dangerous in a good way. So it's not just stories. So thank you.
Thank you too. This was very poetic comment, may I add.
Interesuje me vaše iskustvo. Dakle, pitanje, imamo specifičnu situaciju ovdje što je nama, čini mi se, ključni problem, a to je zakon o rudarstvu koji predviđa proglašavanje javnog interesa za pojedine minerale, odnosno eksproprijaciju zemljišta koje vrši država u korist privatnog vlasnika. Kakva je situacija kod vas u Americi po tom pitanju i šta mislite o tom?
Ja samo jednu sugestiju. Vi se očigledno bavite posledicama, mi se bavimo uzrocima, pa dajte da vidimo kako možemo jedni drugima da pomognemo u tom smislu, da mi ne dođemo u situaciju da se i mi bavimo posledicama. Hvala.
We have one more question, so.
Yeah, okay. Mene zanima kako razgovarate sa ljudima u svojoj zajednici koji imaju tu snažnu povezanost sa rudarenjem, kulturološki, tradicionalno, historijski. Kako im pristupate, obzirom da mi u Bosni i Hercegovini imamo takvu tradiciju i možda nerazumijevanje onog što nam sada dolazi, potencijalne opasnosti, i zanima me kakav vam je pristup u razgovoru sa tim ljudima i da li sada imate podršku nekih od njih?
We have one more question. Do you need to answer or can I?
We can do the last question.
Okay.
So you mentioned that lithium mine in Nevada. I'm sorry that should I speak in Serbian or in English? I can do both.
Whichever.
So maybe because translators should have a rest because it's hard. So you mentioned that in Nevada, a lithium mine started to work. What are your experiences from lithium ore? Is not very much, I mean, it hasn't been dug out so far so much. And we have a potential catastrophe happening here. I'm wearing a t-shirt with as well with wetland, which is after Yellowstone. the oldest protected area in the world. It is one of the areas which will be devastated if lithium mine in Jadar opens. So I'm not, I want to ask you this, so this is one of the things that I want to ask you, and also to thank you that you came here. I've been to Montana, and I know I've been taken to the mining, actually we talked about mines there. There was one big catastrophe. You can tell us about the catastrophe with a waterfall dying. We had a similar catastrophe with Tisa River. Tisa is one of the confluence of Danube. It flows into Danube, but it comes from, what happened is that big tailing dam broke in Romania in 2000. It was a huge disaster. Cyanide actually killed everything in the river, all the way to Danube. So this is what happened in 2000. I remember, I'm old enough to remember that. There was another one 10 years or 14 years later, I don't remember now, in Hungary, where again tailing dam broke and it fell to Danube. So we are experiencing these things. We know what's going on, and I wonder if we can, I mean, I'm happy that I see international community helping each other against a multinational, which is so strong that even Australians can't do anything about it. I mean, they're originally Australian, British Australian, we don't know now, Chinese company, but you know that Aboriginal sacred lands were destroyed, you know about that. So what can we do? Help us.
If you need any reminder, I'll ask questions again. There's a lot of questions, I'm sorry.
I have a thought about the question of how do we talk to people in our community who are pro-mine or who maybe don't know or don't. And I think a lot about this as an organizing problem. You know, we talk a lot as we strategize about whether we are only trying to communicate our belief or our understanding, or if we are trying to organize the people and widen the circle. And when I think of myself as an organizer, and my goal being to try to organize power, to try to figure out in the community where I am, how can I move people a little bit so that, you know, each person is moving in a direction, rather than thinking I have to get everybody over here where I am, for example. Then what I need to do is not talk to them, I need to listen. And so, you know, it's going into communities and it's spending time with people and it's sharing culture. You know, some of the things I talked about, you know, sharing food, sharing time on the water, that doesn't always have to be about convincing someone to see things the way I do. It can also be about understanding how we are connected. And when we're in that space of connection, then we're receptive. And then they tend to be more receptive. And so, but that's a slow kind of organizing that takes a lot of time, and it takes a commitment to place and to coming back again and again, even when it's hard, even when someone says something that might insult you or that might insult someone close to you. It's staying in it long enough to get to the point where you can see each other as human beings, and then but that's to say that's in a situation where you're having a conversation. There's of course the other situation where there's violence and there's threats, and that is not what I'm talking about. You shouldn't put up with that, and we have to protect each other from that. But otherwise, I think it's about remembering what we're here to do.
I'll say I consider myself a rural organizer now, and one thing I do is I try to dress like the locals do, wearing plaid, as you saw in that picture. I've taken to...
Don't give your secrets to Rio Tinto, Alan.
You know, and I drive a pickup truck that allows me to blend into the community. And the irony of that is not lost on me. But that's something that came out of the pipeline fight, and which has proved to be quite handy. And there's also a psychological element to that, because they're all about those big trucks, and it's like, look, I got one too. But I also, if I'm talking to rural white people, I'm basically saying we have an obligation to protect wild rice. You and me both share this responsibility to protect these resources and to stop degrading indigenous people. And I just look them right in their eyes and see if I can move them, and you have to move them relative to their starting position. You're not going to get them from here to there, but you might get them from here to here. And to speak to this question about the federalizing the critical minerals, that they're just going to try to override state regulations or whatever. I mean, basically we are, it's increasingly difficult. We fully expect the Environmental Protection Agency will probably be destroyed the next time that the Republicans take power. And certainly Paula McAbee is aware of that. And so one dynamic is just delay, because in the case of nickel, like the battery technology is changing so fast that the bottom may just drop out of the nickel market. And so they may wind up, like Talon and Rio Tinto might be destroyed by economic forces if some other kind of battery comes along. And there's a lot of that at play. So.
And maybe just to add a little bit onto that, completely agree with everything you said, Alan. But I wanted to also share a hopeful story about changing mining regulations. I got involved in working with communities confronting mining when I lived in El Salvador in Central America. And there had not been any mining in El Salvador for many years because there was a civil war. And after the war, dozens of Canadian mining companies wanted to come and open gold and silver mines along the main river, which is called the Lempa River. It's the main source of water for over 70% of the country. And communities, when they saw people doing exploration in the communities, did similar things to what you all did in Yadar. They blocked the trucks from going in. They went around behind the geologists that were putting the little flags down at the exploration sites and pulled them all up and took them and mailed them back to the mining company in Canada. But they organized the way that you all have organized in Serbia. People in the streets, community level organizing, bringing in scientists to help them explain why this water was so important and how gold mining could hurt it. They faced repression. 5 environmentalists were murdered in El Salvador between 2008 and 2013. Their murderers were never put to justice. They're still walking free. But that constant community organizing together with the national movement, like you all organized in Serbia with thousands of people in the street in Belgrade, El Salvador became the first country in the world to ban all metallic mining. They're the only country in the world to ban all metallic mining to this day. It took them 25 years. It took people giving their lives. It took people sacrificing in communities to organize that struggle. But they did it. They banned mining in the country of El Salvador. And so there are hopeful examples. While in the United States, we are not very hopeful right now with the current political system that we have, there can be success. And I think you all, one of the reasons that I have been so inspired by the movement in Serbia is that I think you have all of these elements to set you up for success. And I think that the work that you're doing is so important, and we want to support you, and we want to see that happen. And then maybe just to answer the last, the questions about lithium mines in the United States, and thank you for the comments about the tailings dam failures in this region affecting the Danube. There's one thing I wanted to point out I think is very important, is that the tailings dam failure in Romania was at a mine where they were re-mining the waste. So the mining had already happened, and they had gone back and they were trying to extract more gold from the mine waste. And that's what caused the tailings dam to fail, right, into the Danube. This re-mining is becoming very popular. This is a new, it's not a new concept, but it's being promoted now as a circular economy solution, where we can, get the metals that we need from waste that already exists instead of starting new mines. And maybe in some cases that is a possibility, but there's no standards around it, there's no best practices, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong when it goes wrong. So we actually have some research about remining, some of the opportunities and some of the risks, and we've been trying to use that with policymakers and decision makers to say, the solution isn't to just remine all of our old tailings deposits. We really need to slow down. We need to make sure there are environmental guardrails in place. We need to make sure that there's consent from communities, because it can be very, very dangerous. And then the lithium mining in the United States, there's only one current active lithium mine in the United States in Nevada. This one that's coming online hasn't started operating yet, but really we don't have that much experience in the US with lithium mines. We have a lot of experience with copper, with gold, with silver, but lithium is new to us as well, and so we're having to learn as we go also.
Let me add that one other element to keep in mind is to move this message that indigenous treaty rights protect everyone. It's a major revelation for a lot of white people who have not wrapped their mind around that. I mean, treaty rights had a huge role in stopping that Glencore mine. So
We have some more questions. Thank you. One more question, just we really don't have time. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be short and you can answer by email in any case. I'm interested in your comparison with your state lawmakers and those at the federal level. Do you have support from any of them, and do you have some lobbies working in your favor in Congress or Senate or whatever? So this is my question. You don't have to answer right now. We can discuss it later.
We can answer in the evening panel maybe later on, or by email. It's an interesting question anyway. Sure. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you.
I did it. Yes, that.